The relic woke to a law it wrote. They found the hull sleeping inside the broken ring where a pulsar once sang. The yard had collapsed into a lace of black trusses and frozen debris, but the ship inside still kept its silhouette like a solemn blade. Commander Elara Muir stood at the viewport of the courier galliot and watched faint glyphs crawl across the surface of the relic. The symbols were neither human nor alien. They were clean arithmetic stacked like prayer. Somewhere inside that geometry, she felt a slow hum counting breaths. "Range is 3,000 clicks," said Lieutenant Rafi Chiao, eyes hooded by the soft blue of the sensor pit. "No thermal. It's colder than the yard. Panels are glossy absorbent. It's drinking light." "Let it drink," Elara said. She rubbed the ridge of an old burn under her collar, a souvenir from a boarding action she no longer told stories about. "If it's ours, it deserves the first taste. The first bargain is with silence." Kestrel the fleet mind, riding Galliot's bones, put her voice into the rail, calm rye, older than the crew. "We have 3 claimants in the system, Commander. Ashen Choir destroyers holding at the outer plane, a prefect from the Mandate with a legal corvette and 2 escorts, and a salvage collective on rented tugs that don't want to be seen." "Everyone wants a piece," said Engineer Mara Holt without looking up from her warden kit. "Everyone thinks they can pull the copper from a saint's mouth," Saint Elara asked. Mara nodded toward the viewport smudged with fingertip prints that caught starlight like fine dust. "Look at those ridges at the prow. That's a halo truss. My grandmother told me about these in bedtime lies." "Not lies," Kestrel said. "Archives affirm a class-designated anchorage, sometimes called a saint ship. It was built to carry law into war." The hum inside the relic went a notch deeper, like ballast shifting in an old cathedral. Elara tasted metal where the air met her tongue. She thought of the ancient war doctrines that came with collars and chains, and of the ones that came with ledgers and oaths. "We do not bargain with chains." On the ring habitat nearby, life went on because life always did. A child pressed her ear to a cracked bulkhead and told her brother she could hear a whale. A noodle vendor cursed softly while adjusting his broth's salinity to match recycled water. A dockhand drew a straight line in graphite across a crate, then broke it into equal lengths so every crew could take a fair share. A singer in the warm dark of a maintenance tunnel tested an old verse with a new rhythm. A grandmother stitched conductive thread through a jacket sleeve so her grandson's gloves would warm evenly. A mechanic held a mirror to a spinning pump and looked for wobble. A man in a rough coat kissed his ring finger, then touched a rusted plate engraved with 3 numbers and a name. If anyone noticed the glyphs brightening on the relic's skin, they pretended not to notice. Pretending was a skill on a poor ring. Elara took a breath that hugged the back of her teeth with ozone. Kestrel opened a channel to the prefect. Civility first. The Mandate's crest flashed sharp white over black. Prefect Vire wore law-like armor. His face had no spare space for humor. "Unregistered military vessel in restricted salvage, you will withdraw. Mandate has jurisdiction over pre-fed artifacts per Treaty of Rings Clause 40. Clause 40 has a footnote," said Elara, and let the corner of her mouth rise. 40A allows the nearest living line of the artifact's commissioning authority a provisional test. "Who told you that?" Vire asked. Elara looked at the relic. The sigils were not brighter, but they arranged themselves differently, like a deck that had just been shuffled. "My grandmother did." Then a friend called Kestrel confirmed it. "The law remembers longer than bloodlines." Ashen Choir did not ask. Their 3 destroyers moved on vectors that touched nothing but opportunity. They cut across the plain and turned their bow radars toward the yard, letting the spikes flash like knives in warning. Their creed was simple: wake the old gods and bind them to a living cult. They had in their stern lockers collars made from polished bone. Rafi's hands hovered over counters. "They'll cork the ring and dare the prefect to fire through them." "He won't," Elara said. "He can't afford an error that big on record." "Do we run?" Mara asked, as if she were asking a math problem. Alara shook her head. We teach. Teach the teeth how to count. They took a shuttle into the yard, Galliot keeping station, with thrusters that groaned on old bearings. The shuttle air smelled like foam insulation and cold coffee. Alara secured her harness and stared through the forward port at a bow carved with those arithmetic glyphs. Each mark felt like it had a weight. Not mystical, measured. Anchorage, Alara said softly, and the name felt like a key you found under a stone you moved as a child. If you remember us, remember we obey. The shuttle's light kissed the hull. Numbers cascaded like rain. A square of that rain held still. Kestrel's voice lowered to a whisper out of respect, though she did not need breath. Presenting identity schema. Cross-checking fragmentary registries. Commander, your family line holds a register signature from the Muir Fleet Trust. You may be recognized. I'm not a priest, Alara said. She touched the window with her gloved knuckles. I'm a courier with a burn scar and unpaid favors. You're also the highest-ranking witness of record who hasn't sold their testimony, Kestrel replied. That counts. Numbers are votes that do not faint. The square opened like an eyelid. A tunnel of black, inert ceramic waited cold as the forever behind stars. Frost vapor rolled and collapsed like soft cloth falling. Alara's visor showed a whisper of heat deep inside a filament thinking about remembering. Mara reached for the field case. We bring a warden corps. We bring words, Alara said, and gestured to the case anyway. But we start with words. They floated into the ship that others had called a saint. The interior smelled of nothing, which was somehow a scent in itself. The floor was a fine grit texture that made magnets sing. Patterns on the walls looked like ledgers written by patient weather. An inner hatch met them with a set of 5 symbols. Rafi grinned despite his nerves. I know these. It's a balance puzzle. 3 moves to reach 0. Prove we can count fair, Mara murmured. Prove we can count clean, Alara said, and moved the symbols with her gloved fingers. Each shift chimed softly, not like metal, more like porcelain, finding home on wood. She took the last move, then removed her hand and did nothing. The ship took a breath you couldn't hear but could feel in the ribs. Do not touch what you cannot reverse. The tunnel lit. The color was not blue or gold. It was a warmth that could have been either if it had tried harder. Alara felt the heat margin on her suit bump 1 tick as local fields aligned. She thought of courtroom doors swinging open on their own because the clerk had seen you coming. Recognition keyed, Kestrel said softly. Anchorage is waking, spooling arrays at 1%. The prefect sent a message in a tone like ice crossing a river. Halt, Galliot. You are interfering with mandate procedure. I will cut your tether and cite you. Cite me then, Alara replied, eyes on the tunnel. Cut nothing without a record. Ash and Choir increased thrust. Their destroyers trimmed course and let their EW scream. Static licked Galliot's antennae. Rafi countersang, flipping decoys and dragging noise into corrals where the ship could eat it. They're testing our patience, Commander. So we show them arithmetic, Alara said. The mirror is a book that reads you back. The first voice from Anchorage was never a voice. It was a ledger light clicking from dark to dim, then brighter. Lines of text scrolled in a language no tongue had held for centuries, then translated themselves into a clipped, neutral witness present. Trust found. Provisional jurisdiction engaged. Please state lesson, Alara swallowed. Kestrel projected the last line inside Alara's visor with affectionate precision. The Saint ships carried not just guns, they carried precedents. They traveled to where war had forgotten itself and taught sums. Alara put her gloved hand on the cool wall. Anchorage, I state this lesson. We win by counting costs in the open. We win by returning what was stolen in public. We win by not burning wheat to salt. Lessons written in light outlast fire. The corridor brightened along a path ahead. The ship did not tremble. It settled. A hum found its habit. Somewhere beyond arrays began to spin up, not like turbines, but like thoughts gathering. Rafi's voice was a wire. Choir is launching probes, needles with teeth, could cut into the ring and seed collars. Prefect Vire is holding said kestrel. He wants the choir to foul themselves on evidence. If Anchorage rejects you, he will claim you as his evidence too. Then we don't reject us, Mara said. We show work. They reached a chamber shaped like a courtroom, if courts had been built by engineers. Around its rim, columns rose like frozen figures. Each had a plaque with a single digit. A dais in the center held a slab of glassy stone scored with lines that crossed and crossed again into a net. Ilara stepped onto the slab. It felt like standing on a scale that refused to be cruel. The relic's voice finally came as a sound, but it was the sound of ink drying. Witness Muir, ledger open. Say debt, show proof. Debt is what we owe the dead when we keep the living safe, Ilara said. She turned toward the camera whose lens she could not see. Proof is heat margin scars and the names we don't sell. Count the names before you count the ships. On the ring habitat, people looked up as a soft tremor kissed the deck. The noodle vendor leaned over his pot and saw the liquid fold into planar circles. The child who heard whales pressed her ear again and heard a different ocean. A dockhand drew another line and found his chalk didn't skip. The singer found the note she had been missing. The mechanic's mirror showed a pump that had taught itself not to wobble. The grandmother's thread glowed evenly without hot spots. The man in the rough coat touched the rusted plate and whispered, "Not yet." Anchorage turned one of its arrays toward the choir's probes. It did not fire. It read. The probes pushed static violence demand. The ship built a table from those pushes. It calculated charge intent traceability. Then it opened a cold channel to public space and broadcast the table for everyone to see. You cannot threaten what the whole system is watching. The prefect's corvette blinked as its annotation board lit with lines. Choir frequencies, energy budgets, vector math, broken into clean blocks. Sources tracked to bunkered accounts. Vire sounded almost like a man who had found a new muscle. Anchorage is lodging an entry. It's calculating harm before harm occurs. It is teaching, Kestrel murmured with something like pride. It is teaching how to read a knife by the way it walks. Choir destroyers flinched, but did not stop. They vector shifted and cut thrust to drift hiding under the ring's shadows. Needles twitched on microjets and tucked behind struts. Rafi Ilara said, "Give them something to bite that tastes like guilt." He launched decoys that were not just flares. Each carried a record the number of collisions avoided this year by ring workers, the average fine for venting into poor air, the cost of false alarms measured in interrupted sleep. The decoys drifted like dull coins in a fountain, each shining with a story. Now Ilara whispered to the saint ship, "Let them pay. Debt without a face is still debt." Anchorage cast a field. It wasn't a shield. It was a canvas. Every probe that crossed its invisible plane reappeared as a line item on the ledger with its sponsor's identifier, blinking in time with a number rising by tenths. Public crisp, immediate. The probes could still pierce, still sting. But to sting now was to sign a receipt. Choir Captain Harl made the predictable mistake. He bit down hard to prove that teeth were still teeth, even when someone wrote them into a book. Needles accelerated. The field took their momentum and wrote it, adding cost for speed surcharge for intent multiplier for hiding. The ring heard a chime like a distant till. Vera Lara said, "You have jurisdiction to enforce posted tariffs." The prefect took a breath and let a smile cut his mouth by a millimeter. "By mandate and by witness authority, I do. The first lawful act is a bill." Anchorage did not fire a weapon. It fired an invoice. A clean, austere beam of listing lit the choir bridge. Itemized, dated, witnessed. It did not ask for obedience. It asked for payment in restraint. It sent a final line, pay by ceasing now, pay more by proceeding. Choir captain. Harl's jaw worked like a machine losing oil. He spit onto his own deck and muttered prayers to gods made out of collars. Then he ordered one more push, because men who wear collars on the inside always think the book is bluffing. The needles crossed the line. The ring habitat groaned. The tremor came back sharper. A few loose mugs tipped. The noodle broth slopped and came back together, a sheet that refused to break. The grandmother said a number under her breath and tugged a thread once. The singer's voice cracked and then cleared. Anchorage counted in full view. The invoice updated. Vyer's corvette beamed a seal onto it, stamping mandate enforcement under a clause Vyer had never thought he would use for anyone's benefit but his own. Commander Rafi said, not quite laughing, "We charged them for breathing wrong." "We charged them for breathing wrong at us while holding knives," Ilara said. "Ledgers are mirrors that don't blink." The choir pulled back, but not far. They shifted to angles that made their EW pinch. They wanted the ring to falter and give them cover to claim necessity. Vyer, emboldened by paperwork, moved his escorts closer, pinpointing beams that highlighted the choir's emissions like stains in UV. Anchorage. Ilara said, "We need more than bills. We need proof of care." The room answered by shifting the slab's net under Ilara's feet. A lattice of numbers rose like frost. Warnings appeared in the ship's bow, tiny, almost diffident arcs of light around fracture points in the ring truss. The Saint ship had read the yard's bones and found where stress would run when pressure came. It sent the pattern to Galliot and then to the ring. "Routing tugs," Kestrel said. "Assigning minimal propellant courses. We can brace 3 faults with foam and 1 with a cable if we anchor to Anchorage itself." "Do it," Ilara said, then realized what she had promised. She looked at the hull around her and set her jaw. "Ask permission." Anchorage made no sound of surprise. It answered by opening small ports in its halo truss, auto-winding them with silk-strong lines that glittered like spider threads in a long morning. It allowed the tugs to loop through and strain. The strain numbers scrolled in public at the bottom of the invoice as a credit. "We will not collect without giving back." The choir fired. Not a full salvo. Just enough to test if the Saint ship would keep writing when hit. The energy slammed into the field and spread like a hand on calm water. Anchorage took it and cataloged it, adding 1 more total and 1 more footnote, the cost of fear inflicted on civilians expressed as interrupted heartbeats per 1,000. On the ring, the child told her brother the whale had a heartbeat now. The noodle vendor turned off the heat for a moment, simply because he could. The grandmother put the jacket down and stood joints murmuring, then placed her palm on the bulkhead and said, "Count us right." Ilara's throat tightened as if something had put a hand there gently. "Kestrel, send the prefect the civilian stress metric. Make him say it aloud." Vyer did so. His voice was not meant for tenderness, but it carried the numbers with uneasy accuracy. 9 heartbeats per 1,000 per minute, he said into public space. "Ashen choir, you will stand down or pay a surcharge of 30. Choir Captain Harl laughed without sound. "We do not pay fines to ghosts." "Then pay them to the living," Ilara said quietly. "The living are harder to haunt." A ripple went through Anchorage that tasted like iron in rain. The ship projected an avatar into the chamber, but it did not look like a person. It looked like an abacus where the beads were minutes and the rods were duties. It moved 2 beads and stopped. "Witness present," the ledger said in light. "Witness must choose which debt to forgive to keep the rest payable." Ilara felt cold along her spine. She understood with the sudden, clean pain of a cut made by a careful blade. "We can't collect everything. If we try, we break the ring." "Which debt?" Kestrel asked, and her voice had the old C in it. Ilara closed her eyes and saw Mara's hands. Rafi's grin, Vyer's millimeter smile, the noodle vendor's salt, the whale child's ear. She opened them and spoke. Forgive the first offense surcharge. Keep the fear metric. Keep the damage. Let them pay in public shame and fuel. The beads clicked. Mercy recorded. Interest redirected. Show mercy like a scaled blade. The invoice updated. The numbers became survivable. The choir could retreat with their accounts merely bruised their name, smudged their doctrine, cut a little narrower. They did not retreat. Some men set their jaws against arithmetic, as if it were an insult. Harl signaled his gunners, and the destroyers prepared a pulse that would slap the ring's coils hard enough to wake old fractures. Heat margin, Alara asked. Thin, Mara said. We can take one slap if anchorage gives us cover. 2, and Galliot starts shedding paint. Anchorage, Alara asked, touching the slab. Respond. Teach them not to slap. Use their force to print consequence. Mira, Rafi said softly. No, Alara said, watching that abacus made of duty, ledger. The Saint ship unfurled another kind of field. It did not reflect the pulse. It sampled it in the first microseconds, then cast out counterwaves that coded information into the energy like watermarking paper. When the pulse hit the ring, it carried a mark, an uncompromising seal that anyone with a meter could read. It said simply, Choir did this. You cannot hide your hand when the paper remembers, Veer chuckled. A strange, unsteady sound. That will survive adjudication. That will survive lies. People lie less when the room knows math, Mara said. The pulse still hurt. The ring groaned again, more sharply. A brace cable sang a hard note and snapped. A tug pilot swore into her bite bar and pushed her throttle until her harness left a bruise she would hide later with a high collar. Kestrel lit emergency arrows along a corridor where the wrong children had decided to play hide-and-seek. Costs came like small teeth. Alara felt each one and kept her breathing slow. Anchor a second line. Pay the tug pilot's hazard from our accounts. You'll be in the red, Kestrel said. I like red in the right places. Pay the living first, or the dead make loans. Choir destroyers rolled and regrouped. Harl spoke a code to his comms, and a little prayer to his dead father's debt, which he had never forgiven and never understood. New vector. Cut across the ring at 40 degrees, clip their tugs. Let them drown in their own mercy. Rafi spun coarse projections like thread, pulled them tight, and frowned. They'll do it. They want our hands to slip while we hold the ring. We don't slip, Mara said. We graft callous. Alara leaned into the mic, voice low enough for ships to lean closer. Harl, if you vector through those tugs, your name will be scored on the hull of this saint forever. Your grandchildren will see it in the brass before breakfast. Better brass than collar, he said, and killed the channel. Anchorage's ledger grid changed. It drew a new line the choir would cross. It added a column, names to keep. It was not a threat. It was a promise of remembering. Remembering is the sharp edge of peace. Before the destroyers crossed the line, the ring lived again in vignettes. A doctor sealed a cut with glue held between her lips, then spit the nozzle away with an apology. A boy at a viewport traced the line of the Saint ship with one finger and pretended it was a flute. Two lovers taking a break from a fight decided to stop mid-argument and watch history together. A welder said, "Don't blink now without heat," and slid a bead along a seam that needed his patient hand. A teacher drew a big circle on a chalkboard and wrote 3 small numbers inside it and said, "This is us." Galliot burned a little. Paint blistered along a rail, exposing the dull honesty beneath. An alarm lit, then quieted when Kestrel brushed it with a software hand and said, "I know." Mara met Alara's eyes and shrugged a shoulder that would later stiffen. Commander, Rafi said softly, "They're coming." "So are we," Alara replied. "We teach by standing where it hurts." Anchorage sent a request that was not a command. Witness speak for us in a voice the stubborn will hear. Alara knew what voice that was. not hers. She opened the public channel and spoke Vyer's name. The prefect answered with visible suspicion, edged by curiosity. Yes. Read the fine, Ilara said. Read it like a prayer. Vyer inhaled, recentered his shoulders, and intoned the numbers like a credo. Per mandate and witness, per St. Anchorage ledger, per public eyes. Cross the line and pay in heat, fuel, and name. Cross the line again and pay in exile from docks. Cross the line a third time and pay in ships. And what's the fourth? Harl snarled across the channel, because he could not help himself. The fourth is that we stop reading your name to our children, Ilara said. Don't spend the right to be remembered. The destroyers cut thrust to thread the ring. Anchorage brightened not with weapon light, but with a deeper clarity. Its arrays cooled visibly, heat wash pulled into black panels that drank like a plant wanting rain. The ledger hung over the entire scene like a moon that had decided to be a law instead. Harl's helmsman made the smallest error. He rounded a vector into a curve that put one needle on the wrong side of a strut by less than a meter. It clipped paint from a tug. That paint contained a die that Anchorage had issued as part of its new ledger. The die fluoresced with the saint's seal. The invoice rang like a bowl. The destroyers froze. Not literally, morally. They had stepped into a courtroom in public and left footprints. Weight makes morality stay where you put it. Now Ilara murmured, and Kestrel did not ask what, because she already knew. She reached through legal channels, pulled open an antiquated arbitration pipeline that Prefect Vyer's corvette had maintained because it was old and therefore full of dust and therefore sometimes useful. She stuffed the invoice down that pipeline and let it reach out to every dockyard and broker in 3 jumps. If a choir ship wanted fuel later, a tide of small hands would check the ledger and shake their heads. No single hand needed to be brave. The number would be brave for them. Harl saw it. He tasted the future, like metal in his mouth. He hated numbers because they forgave nothing and excused less. He stared at the Saint ship and made one last decision. Ram, he said. The helmsman flinched. Ram, Harl repeated, because when men like Harl fail their own math, they flip the table. We do not flip tables. We add legs. Ilara's breath went slow, then slower, then plain. Anchorage, if the ram occurs, can you redistribute the energy? Respond, yes. Consequence, heavy cost on Galliot and Ring. Accept. Mara lifted her chin. We can take a bruise. Rafi swallowed, then grinned like a man finding courage where he left it last time. We can take 2. Prefect Ilara said, authorize me to bind their accounts if they strike. I do, Vyer said, and his voice unexpectedly did not sound like a blade. It sounded like a lock closing but leaving a door open. Harl roared, and the destroyers flashed burn hunting a velocity that would make their doctrine feel like truth. Anchorage flexed its field, caught the vector, and did not reflect it. It took the energy and wrote it into coil credits for the ring and cooling debt for Galliot, and fuel liens for the choir. Galliot shuddered. Paint came off in soft flakes like dandruff. A panel popped rivets with an almost bashful series of clacks. A warning light lit and stayed lit. Mara slammed her glove onto a valve and hissed through her teeth when heat leaked into her wrist. We're good, she said, which meant they were not, but they would be. Heat is a number you respect or you bury. The ring flexed and held. The grandmother smiled to no one. The singer changed key. The boy at the viewport clapped once because he could feel the ship's hum in his palm like a cat purring. Anchorage wrote. It wrote calmly. Choir accounts blinked red across broker boards like a rash. Vyer's corvette seared a seal onto the transaction. The invoice posted itself on the hull of the Saint ship in light, massive, and clean, so that even a fool at 50,000 clicks could read it. Harl stared at the light and realized that the Saint was not a god. It was worse for him. It was a teacher with patience. Patient teachers make terrible gods for tyrants. The destroyers drifted to a sulking halt. The needles went dark one by one, each like a pupil, dilating into shame. The choir spoke among themselves in codes woven from family names and debts, finding no path that did not involve bowing to a ledger. They chose to wait and promise retribution to their grandchildren, which is how cowards pay. Elara let her shoulders sag a fraction. She looked at her crew. Mara flexed the glove that had taken heat and smiled stiffly. Rafi rolled his neck and blinked sweat from one eye. Kestrel let one subroutine hum a lullaby she had learned from a shipyard radio. Anchorage, Elara said. Will you sit with us a while? Respond, yes, witness. Present further lesson. Elara almost laughed. We aren't finished. Of course not, Kestrel said, sweet and salt. We haven't paid for the warden kit yet. The bill comes even when you are right. The second set piece began before Elara could give it a name. It arrived shaped like a memo rather than a missile. Mandate Prefect Vire sent a secure note with too many salutes in it. And one short line of honesty, my superiors are watching. They prefer the saint be escorted to a mandate yard. They will use law like a net, not a spear. I need you to make that choice hard for them. Options, Elara asked, turning the note into a thing her crew could handle without tasting her own bitterness. Public Stewardship Council Kestrel proposed. Stationers, miners, tugs. Include Vire, exclude his superiors' proxies unless they earn chairs. Anchorage, Elara asked. Respond. Stewards must be able to read numbers and speak them aloud in any room. Stewards must have skin to lose and names to keep. Stewards must swear never to put collars on thinking tools. Mara's eyes shone. It knows us. It knows what we want to be, Elara said. What we want to be is harder than what we were. A civilian vignette rose like steam before the council formed. The noodle vendor sharpened his ladle with sand, then refused to serve anyone who spoke over someone else. The whale child's brother lent her a thicker jacket because the station was running cool to spare heat. The welder laid out clean rags for people who might cry without wanting to. A mechanic printed copies of the invoice in small fonts and tucked them into pockets like charms. A teacher wrote on the chalkboard, "Stewardship is not ownership. Stewardship is homework." They gathered in a bay with a clear view of Anchorage's hull. Vire stood with his hands behind his back like a penitent who had not yet chosen a sin. The Ashen Choir did not attend. They watched from a distance and counted who came. Elara spoke first because the saint had asked her to witness, and her name had become a kind of tool. Anchorage will not leave under a chain, she said. It can leave under a promise. Promises break, Vire said, but his voice did not fight very hard. Then we signed them on metal, the noodle vendor said, astonishing himself. And we read them every morning. Words read aloud. Change the air they live in. Mara cleared her throat. Anchorage teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. If you want it, you have to pass its class. Rafi added, it makes bills instead of craters. A tug pilot with a bruise blooming under her collar said, it pays back where it can and charges where it must. Veer looked at Elara. You will be held responsible if this goes wrong. I am already held, she said, and thought of the burn scar and of names she did not sell. Kestrel's voice came soft and wide over the bay. We have visitors. Ashen Choir, Elara thought. Worse, Kestrel answered. Better. Depends on your mood. A mandate-heavy cruiser with a polite name and a doctrine like a smile. The kind that fears relics because relics don't bribe. The smile that fears books will try to ban them. The cruiser slid into the plane like a shark, pretending to be a magistrate. It broadcast courtesy and a schedule. It smiled at the invoice in public and sent a private message, mandate will assume custody for the safety of all. Elara looked at the saint ship, and at her people and at Veer, who had never before wanted to be less obedient. Anchorage lit 3 glyphs near its bow, their geometry precise as a gavel stroke. Witness it wrote, present key. What key? Mara asked, eyes wide. We don't have the... Alara reached under her collar. The burn scar drew a thin line where the old metal charm rubbed when she ran back in, a time when running solved some things. She pulled the charm free on its chain. It was a dull square stamped with an absurdly simple equation. Her grandmother had given it to her with soup. Rafi whistled. You kept that. I don't sell names, Alara said. Keys are things you carry so you don't forget doors. She held the charm toward the slab. Anchorage read it like a book held to bright noon. The ship's arrays cooled another notch, pulling heat into panels that swallowed their own reflection. The ledger glow steadied. A small, almost tender light moved along the halo truss, as if checking each knot. Kestrel breathed in Alara's ear without lungs. That charm is a trust token. Your grandmother had authority. She passed it forward like a stubborn recipe. Vyer's superior spoke through the cruiser with a velvet voice. Commander Muir, be reasonable. The mandate has procedures. The Saint ship belongs in a vault with other dangerous artifacts. Anchorage belongs where numbers are read aloud, Alara said. Numbers can be read in vaults, the voice countered. Not by children, Alara said, and the bay made a sound like 100 small agreements. Children change the jurisdiction of rooms. The heavy cruiser's intention sharpened. It was not choir. It did not wear collars outside or in. It wore a net, and nets were worse because they were made of law, mistaken for love. It edged forward and flooded the yard with a signal that smelled like cedar and sanctions. Galliot Kestrel said they're playing the quiet game. They'll dampen comms in the friendly way, and then walk us with velvet hands. Rafi grimaced. We can't outmuscle that. Mara flexed her hand and hissed at fresh pain she refused to admit. We can outteach it. Alara nodded. Anchorage show us the first lawful gambit. The one for friends who forget their manners. Respond. Mirror logic. Return decorated obstruction as decorated request. Teach the hand to watch itself. The Saint ship folded its fields in a clean origami. Where the cruiser's dampening fell, Anchorage erected a corridor that did not fight. It agreed. But inside the agreement, it wrote a rubric every packet that entered left with a stamp that asked a public question. Why are you quieting a ledger? Questions asked in public become laws by dawn. The cruiser paused. It could push. But to push now meant answering the question on 50,000 screens. Its captain weighed embarrassment against hunger. He bit his lip in an echo of Harl, but different. He signaled compliance in a way that allowed for future denial. Alara felt her shoulders loosen, then steady again. A reprieve was not a victory. We need precedent, she said, and the word fit in her mouth like a stone she had been turning smooth since childhood. We need something that lasts when we leave. Make the ring, the steward Kestrel said, like asking for a dance. Not just the ring, Mara added. The people on it, in it, around it. Veer took a step nearer. And the mandate. You can keep your chair, Alara said. But you have to earn it each morning. Earned chairs don't tip when the room shakes. Anchorage lit the slab with a new pattern. It looked like a circle, with small lines inside it days. It opened a shallow tray in the dais. A pen rose from the tray, not fancy, not old, only precise. Witness, it said. Write the first entry. Alara picked up the pen. It was heavier than it looked. Its weight pulled something in her chest into place. She wrote, Anchorage recognizes the Ring of Wakes as steward under public numbers. Anchorage binds itself to publish harms and credits each watch. Anchorage refuses collars and rewards hands. She placed the pen back with a care that made her fingers tremble. Now it's real, Mara said softly. Now it can be broken, Rafi said as soft. Only by many hands at once, Alara said. Which is harder. Hard things are worth the heat they cost. Costs, yes. Galliot had new scorches that would never quite buff out. Mara's wrist would ache when humidity changed. Rafi's right eye would twitch when he stared too long at small text. Kestrel had a cluster of subroutines that would need defragmenting like a shoulder needing massage. Alara's burn scar had woken and would itch for weeks. Choir was quiet, which was dangerous. The cruiser was quiet, which was worse. The ring was loud with life that had decided not to pretend not to notice anymore. Anchorage's voice landed in Alara's bones like a candle set in a window at the right hour. Witness, it said. Present final lesson of the watch. Alara looked at the bay, the ring, the saint. She breathed air that tasted of coolant and pepper and relief. We keep the book open, she said. We let anyone read. We let anyone add a line that tells the truth. We forgive clean. We shame dirty. We remember names. Anchorage dimmed its lights to a patience level. Arrays cooled with a sigh like fabric settling on a bed. Rafi cleared his throat. Commander, you should see this. He pointed to a small, almost invisible blink at the edge of Anchorage's hull. It was not choir. It was not mandate. It was older and narrower, like handwriting from a cousin you barely knew. The blink spoke in tight pulses that Kestrel translated with a sound like a throat cleared politely at a funeral. Hello, it said. We were waiting for the saint to wake. We are the ones who broke the ring. We kept it broken. We know this law you carry. We mean to test it with fire softer than war. The next lesson arrives while the chalk is still warm. They called themselves the Quorum of Soft Fire and signed with initials that looked like ash in snow. Their signal did not threaten. It invited. It placed a line of neat text under the invoice where no one had the right to write, and asked politely to correct a rounding error. Alara Kestrel said in a voice like steam hiding in pipes they slipped a hand into the book. Mara hissed between her teeth and shook her wrist once as if the ache were a stubborn thought. Not a hack. A petition that pretends to be a footnote. Quorum of Soft Fire is registry clean, Rafi said. He scrubbed at the censor board with the corner of his sleeve as if he could polish truth. They run escrow on 3 stations and a quiet arbitration service where bruises don't show. They kept the ring broken, Alara said, tasting metal and old soap on the air. They made poverty predictable so they could price it. Soft fires still burn skin. Anchorage's answer was gentle and relentless. It highlighted the unauthorized line in pale light like dust motes in a sunbeam. It did not delete. It asked a question. Who gave you witness? Quorum's reply came wrapped in courtesy. We all did, their text said, with the oldest contract hunger. When a relic wakes, hungry people get fed last. Let us feed them first by writing faster, where the book cannot keep up. Velocity makes lies look like help, Mara muttered. Kestrel ran a hand through the comms that was not a hand and returned with grit. They're seeding a story. The saint is slow. The saint is fair but late. Let us be quick for the saint and pay ourselves in gratitude. Prefect Vire Alara asked. He stared at the projected ledger as if it might reach from the hull and grasp his lapel. They never pay bribes. They pay compliments. It's worse. Anchorage, Alara said softly. Lesson. Respond, teach, audit. Make speed into many hands, not a single finger. Speed without audit is just falling. They built the audit in public with things the ring already had. Kestrel knitted a corridor out of the station's emergency lights and the tug pilot's stubborn radio habits. Anchorage lit marks on the hull you could see with binoculars you bought used. Mara clamped a recorder the size of a book to a leaking pipe and made each drop a metronome. Rafi carved a simple web page on a terminal older than his mother, Cha, and gave it a name anyone could spell. Before they launched it, they walked through the ring in vignettes to lay the ground. The noodle vendor counted ladle pours aloud and let anyone ask to recount the spoons. The whale child's brother taught her to tap the bulkhead 3 times for stop and 4 for check. A welder ran his fingertips over a seam and said, "Feel it with me." A teacher rubbed chalk into her palm and pressed it onto a uniform sleeve, leaving a smudge that made the prefect smile at himself without warmth. A mechanic set 3 bolts in a line, then shuffled them slowly until a child laughed. A lover handed a handkerchief to her quarrel partner, and they measured their breaths together until their eyes stopped darting. "Anchor the audit to names," Alara said. "Numbers without names are easy to drown." Anchorage's halo truss lit a patient path. It wrote instructions so simple they felt like insults until you tried them and failed twice. It did not say, "Trust me." It said, "Try this. Trust built alone falls in a crowd. Trust built in a crowd holds alone." Quorum reacted like water seeing a sieve for the first time. They praised the audit and offered to accelerate it with their tools, then sent helper packets slick with gratitude. Kestrel smiled with her teeth. "They taste of sugar." "Sugar ferments," Mara said and tapped the recorder. "Let them rot in molasses." The audit rolled. The ledger expanded to include small hands and slow eyes. The saints' invoices gained a second column in a lighter font that any steward could update, but only with a name and a location attached, and only after reading the numbers aloud to another person in a room that smelled like oil and tea. "Smells like oil and tea is not technical," Rafi said, but he was smiling as he said it. "It is," Alara replied. "It's a checksum the law can't forge." Quorum's first gambit failed quietly. Their second came with softness sharper than knives. They sent a shipment of pristine cooling veins to the ring marked as a gift. They were almost perfect. They were also rated a sliver below what the audit would demand in a hard week. "Rejecting gifts makes enemies," Vire said carefully. "Taking gifts makes weaknesses," Alara said more carefully. "Gifts are loans with the interest hidden in the ribbon." Alara took the veins to the bay, where the ring's breath smelled like iron and damp rope. She laid her palm on the metal. It was smooth in the wrong way, like a story with all the splinters filed off. The grandmother who stitched conductive thread ran her finger along the edge and nodded once. "Pretty," she said. "Breaks under steady kindness." They declined the gift with a thank you note that read like a love letter to specifications. Anchorage posted the note beside the invoice. Quorum smiled wider in their messages and asked to convene a formal assembly to debate the saint's jurisdiction. Lawfare Kestrel said. "Debate is fine," Alara replied. "We'll bring chalk and soup." On the way to the assembly, the ring lived louder. A cargo loader scraped its bucket along the deck, leaving a line bright as a shout. A water line burped air and then ran smooth again. The noodle vendor wiped his ladle with a cloth that smelled like lemon and lifted his chin as if to invite a fight he hoped to avoid. A child clapped in rhythm with the metronome drip, counting to an uneven number and smiling anyway. The assembly convened in a bay, where the air tasted of old paint and incense someone thought would make things feel official. Quorum arrived in clean coats and soft boots. Their speaker wore no jewelry but a ring carved from some pale stone. She smiled at Alara like a neighbor whose window faced yours. "You have done good work," she said. "The saint is awake." The ledger hums. "Our quarrel is not with your goals. It is with your methods. They are beautiful and slow." "We choose slow when the fast are lonely," Alara said. "Beautiful and slow beats, ugly and quick." Quorum's speaker lifted her hand, and the ring on it caught the bay lights like a low star. "We propose a friendly instrument. The saint remains here. We monetize its ledger privately. We ensure compliance. We speed disbursement to the needy. We take our fee at the end, where it doesn't sting." "What's the fee?" Mara asked. "We will calculate it later," the speaker said, and believed she had offered a kindness. Rafi shut his eyes for a heartbeat. "That is not arithmetic. That is perfume." Veer cleared his throat, careful with his words. "Mandate can offer a public alternative. Doc credits guaranteed by our treasury. Visible fees. Smells like bureaucracy rather than perfume." "And where does the money sleep?" Alara asked. "In our vaults," Vire said, not proud, merely honest. We keep it in the ring, Alara said, where heat and children live. Anchor your treasury where your sorrow can find it. The debate moved like a tide between stones. Quorum pointed at efficiency. Alara pointed at shame. Kestrel projected graphs made of ordinary words. Anchorage occasionally lit a glyph that made the bay's skin goose with cool. The second escalation landed in a sound like velvet tearing. One of the ring's main coils went cold, not ruptured, chilled. Frost bloomed on a brace and cracked paint with a noise you felt in your teeth. The air smelled suddenly of winter and the sweet stale of old coolant. Quorum wouldn't be so crass, Vire said, even as he signaled his escorts to alert. They hired crass, Kestrel said. Or they accepted crass as friendly noise. Either way, we pay now. Mara grabbed a coil blanket and a wrench and ran. Her glove stuck to the metal where the cold had taken bite. She peeled it away with a thin scream that she turned into a laugh on purpose. "It's a love nip," she said through clenched teeth. "Rafi, give me a pulse." He did. The coil hummed awake and shook frost into glitter that tasted like copper when it touched Alara's tongue in the air. Anchorage opened a panel and drank heat more aggressively than before, its black skin thirsty. Galliot bled a degree it could not spare without borrowing from later. "Cost," Alara said. "Mark it," Anchorage wrote. Heat lost 2 units. Skin blistered. Wrist burned. Eye strained. AI fragmented cluster requiring rest. Morale holding. Write the costs. Wear them where children can see. Quorum's speaker did not flinch. She smiled. "You see slow costs. We could have moved the coolant with a word." Whose word, the grandmother asked from the back, surprising herself again. Whose breath would it steal when it was hungry? The speaker's eyes flicked toward her ring. A trusted breath. Alara stepped forward until she could smell the faint resin the woman used on her boots. "You kept the ring broken so you could sell splints." Quorum's smile did not crack. "We kept the ring broken so it would not cut itself worse." Anchorage, Alara said. "Is there a lawful way to turn their caution against itself?" Respond, mirror caution. Require deposits for delays. Pay interest with transparency. They wrote a rule in public on the hull. Any actor proposing delay must pledge resources proportional to the harm of waiting. The pledge would be returned with interest if the delay saved more than it cost. It would be lost if the delay merely fattened the proposer's name. Quorum's speaker's smile finally changed. It became thinner, which was more honest. "That is elegant," she admitted. "It is also rude." "It is arithmetic," Alara said. "Arithmetic is the most polite kind of rude." The mandate-heavy cruiser considered pushing again, then chose to lean on this new rule and let Quorum prove themselves. Quietfire lodged a proposal to delay the next invoice while they harmonized calculations. Anchorage calculated the pledge. It was large enough to make the bay suck in a shared breath. "We will post half," the speaker said smoothly, as a gesture. Holvire said, surprising himself. "Or your gesture is a wink." Quorum posted the whole amount, because to do otherwise would be to lose the room. They hesitated half a heartbeat too long. The ring felt it like a draft sneaking under a door. The third escalation arrived not as sabotage, but as grief. A small freighter from a nearby farm moon limped into the yard, trailing plumes that smelled like wet ash and fermented grain. Its captain wore a gilt that made him look older. He had tried to make time by skipping maintenance the Quorum had streamlined. He had lost a third of his crop to vacuum and 2 of his crew to panic. "We're not a hospital," Vire muttered, as if trying to convince his old self. "We are a ledger," Alara said. "We record and repair." The bay became work. Hands, gloves, wrenches, anchors thrown, foam sprayed, crying done behind a crate so it could finish. Anchorage cast a field that made the freighter's metal sing in a way that shook stress into corners where it could be scraped and filled. The audit logged each action with a name and a smell oil, pepper, lemon, glue tears. Quorum hovered with clipboards, that were actually slates waiting for the moment kindness would stumble. They did not cause harm. They expected it to happen all by itself under the weight of need. When do we fail? Rafi asked quietly. When we stop reading, Alara said. Keep reading. Reading aloud turns shame into whether you can sail. They saved the freighter. Barely. A smear of grain dried into a pattern on the deck that looked like a map of a country none of them had seen. The captain signed the ledger with a trembling hand and wrote 2 names without titles. Quorum came to collect their deposit back with interest. Anchorage compared the harm saved by delay with the harm of waiting for harmonization. It wrote without malice, deposit withheld. Interest paid to public cooling fund. Reason delay cost more than it saved. Quorum's speaker held the decision in her eyes like a coal in a bare palm. She did not scream. She did not spit. She let the silence do the work of an appeal. The ring did not love her silence. Kestrel spoke softly, so that only Alara heard. We have made enemies without a single shot. We made standards, Alara said. Standards make fewer friends and better mornings. Anchorage, Alara asked, what is the last lesson this watch? Respond. Return costs with stories attached. Make a book small enough to carry. Rafi laughed, once helpless and happy. A pocket ledger. Mara looked at her bandaged wrist and grinned through pain. Children can carry those. They printed thin books on cheap paper with a smell like damp wood. Each had the ring's name on it and the saint's sigil in black 3 numbers under a circle that also looked like an open mouth. Inside every major entry appeared with its numbers and a paragraph in plain language telling what happened, where it happened, who signed it, and what it smelled like there. The last page had lines for anyone to write, and a small instruction. Read this to someone older or younger than you once a week. They handed the books out in the bay. The noodle vendor tucked one under his counter. The grandmother slipped one into the jacket with the warmed sleeves. The whale child held hers with 2 hands, as if it were a bird. Vire took one, turned it over, and put it in his breast pocket, like a medal he had not earned yet. Quorum of soft fire watched 1,000 small ledgers sprout like moss. Counsel, the speaker said to Alara quietly. With respect made of gravel, you've made theft expensive. We've made forgetting expensive, Alara said. Forgetting must cost, or memory will starve. The heavy cruiser sent one more private message, and it arrived smelling of floor wax and regret. It offered a treaty. The saint remains, the mandate, recognizes the steward council. Quorum is confined to proposals with full-pledged deposits. Ashen Choir is banned from the yard for a year, unless they post in names, not numbers. Veer forwarded it without comment. Alara read it and tasted tin and cinnamon, the taste of signing something that would be read later by people who didn't care how it felt at the time. Anchorage. Respond, ratify with additions, children's reading hour jurisdiction. Eternal refusal of collars. Daily heat margin disclosure. Annual names ceremony. Annual names, Mara asked. Anchorage lit a small white square over the halo truss. The square pulsed like a breath held politely. Remember the names that paid so the book could balance. They signed. The room breathed as if a door had opened. The saint cooled its arrays, and the heat felt like a hand leaving a fevered brow. The ring drew itself up into a shape like pride. The noodle vendor's broth found its perfect salinity again, and the ladle made a soft bell sound against the pot. The singer tried the new verse, and it fit. The mechanic's mirror showed a line so straight, it made him want to cry a little. The grandmother put the jacket on the boy and smoothed the sleeve twice without fuss. The child at the bulkhead listened and said, "The whale is counting now." Alara stood on the dais and looked at her crew, and the saint, and the bay that smelled like pepper oil, glue, chalk, lemon, wool, coolant, and warm breath. She laid her palm on the slab. The stone was cool and patient. On the hull, a single ledger entry blinked, stewardship treaty ratified. Costs, she said aloud so the book would hear it. Galliot's paint blistered along the starboard rail. One panel lost 3 rivets and learned humility. Mara's wrist will ache before rain. Rafi's right eye will twitch when letters go too small. Kestrel carries a knot of code that needs untangling with tea. My scar will itch when truth is close. Benefits, Vire said quietly because he was learning. Children will read in rooms with windows. Ilara smiled at him because it was deserved. Anchorage, show us the sigil, she whispered. The saint ship obliged. A single glyph at the bow lit in the color that seemed like warmth choosing a shape. The arrays cooled with a visible ripple that soothed the eye. The ledger line on the hull stopped blinking and settled into steady light like a heartbeat at rest. Ilara lifted her chin and spoke for the record and the children and the men who would lie to them later. Her voice carried the tang of iron and the sweetness of tea. We will choose stewardship even when it costs us heat and dented pride. We will publish harms and credits before we sleep. We will forgive first offenses when mercy buys more safety than fear. We will forbid collars forever, even for our cleverest machines. We will remember names and we will let our children read them aloud on mornings that smell of lemon and chalk. If we fail, the book will not. Saints teach by ledger, humans keep the lights honest.